Patrick, thank you for joining us this morning. You're here with Selwyn District councillors and leadership team, and Ben and George, I'll hand the floor to you to introduce the work and introduce Patrick to us. Thanks.
Sweet. We're just trying to locate our slides, but yeah. So this government is talking a lot about city and regional deals. So we thought it'd be helpful for you guys to just hear about it. Patrick will walk through some of the examples around the world and some of the direction that may or may not come out of the government. So it's really just for your information, so that you know how it works. After that, we've got a conversation on how it could work in a Selwyn District context as well that we can work through. But it's important that we also just keep in mind that we don't actually know what the mechanism will look like yet. So we don't want to start running off doing anything to chase these things yet, because we're not 100% sure what it's going to deliver. So yeah, Patrick will run through that. He's got a wealth of knowledge. Do you want to add anything on, Patrick? No. So yeah, we'll just leave it to him to run through that for the next 20 minutes. We'll have some question time and then we'll jump into how it could work for us.
And thank you, Ben. Just with the agenda, we've got Patrick presenting, and then we've got some further conversation. Is that after Patrick leaves, just for ourselves?
Patrick might stick around because he can provide that context, but we'll lead that conversation from here.
Okay. Excellent.
Thanks. We don't have those specific slides, but maybe Patrick could share them, or we could we'll grab that stick.
Ben, kia ora koutou, ko Patrick McVeigh, toko ingo. Thanks very much for inviting me this morning. George, are you going to share the slides from your
Patrick, end? Can you just hang a fire? You're very quiet at our end. Is your volume up high?
Yes, should be. I'll just see if I can adjust my microphone at all.
We had this trouble with Keith last week.
Did we?
Yeah.
Is that any better yet?
Patrick, just give us a couple of minutes. We'll just check the volume at our end.
Don't keep talking, and I'll.
All right, keep going, Patrick.
You hear me okay now?
Yes, actually, just keep talking about anything in general, not necessarily your presentation, as we fiddle with the volume.
I'll keep talking for now. Hopefully, you can get the volume right. My settings seem to be okay at this end, but you never know with technology, do you?
Yeah, it's getting slightly better. What's the weather like? Oh, perfect. That's much better.
Okay, great. So are we happy to start? George, are you intent? Here we go. George is going to run the slides. So just very quickly, by way of introduction, so I'm Patrick McVeigh. I'm a technical director at Becker. Prior to that, I spent 6 years with Martin Jenkins and then with one of the Auckland council agencies, the Economic Development Agency. But as you can probably tell in my accent, hail from the UK, worked in a number of places on inputs to some of the first wave of city deals in the UK, which was back in kind of 2011. I think I first talked about city deals in a New Zealand context in 2017 in the Herald, and so it's good to see that there's some movement since then. I've provided these slides to George and Ben for your information. I won't go through every single one of them in detail because there's quite a lot of information. The other thing I'll just say at the outset is some of these slides come from a joint masterclass I ran with Linda Mead at Kaimena for Infrastructure New Zealand. So this includes some of the input from that masterclass, which I've also shared separately with George and Ben. So if we go on to the next slide, George, what we'll try and kind of cover is a little bit of the background, my understanding of the current context in New Zealand. I won't spend too long talking about the detail of some of the overseas examples, but I'll highlight a couple of issues, and I'll give some observations towards the end on what I think are some of the strengths and weaknesses and the things we should start thinking about now, even in advance advance of government policy becoming clear in this space. So I'll take us through that in the time that we've got, have some time for questions, but there's also information in the slides for you afterwards. So if we move on to the next slide, the next context, really when we talk about city deals, which I'm using as a shorthand here for city and regional deals as they're being described in New Zealand, these are really about kind of bespoke, if you look at the ones particularly from the UK, they're bespoke packages of funding and decision-making powers which between central and local government. So the process is really about central and local government coming together to agree on what are the things that are going to make the biggest difference to improving the economic performance and well-being of their communities, and how can they two levels of government work together to better implement and fund some of these activities. One of the things we'll come back to is this challenge and issue around funding in the current economic environment. It's worth noting that within the overseas deals, sometimes there is some dedicated funding, but it's also about some of the concessions, ways of working, other things that you might ask for from government to better enable you to implement the things that you wish to do locally. So if we keep moving down, what I will say is I won't linger on this, but just to say that it's not a new idea. It's been around in several different jurisdictions, works in several different ways. Often in the New Zealand context, we talk about the experiences in the UK and Australia. The Australian model was very closely mirrors the UK model. The UK model's probably been running for a bit longer, has a bit more variety. So we talk about city deals, but reality is in the UK, there's been city deals, growth deals, devolution deals, and it's been a process over time. So it's something important point to note is probably whatever we see from government, we should be approaching it as this is the first step, hopefully, towards greater localism and greater devolution, and not everything will be achieved in the first outcome. It's also notable that when you look at places like the UK, while the first wave of deals, particularly Manchester, gets quite a lot of attention, the subsequent deals have been able to kind of learn lessons and apply those in their own localities as well. So it's not always necessary to be the first kind of cab off the ranks to get the right deal for the future. If we move on, George, to the next slide, the point I would make here is that while we are still waiting to see the detail of the initiative in New Zealand, it's worth thinking about deals as an additional tool that can be added in to some of the other things that are currently possible, for example, how you use IFF or the work that you're already doing locally. And this will be there won't be a magic bullet, but they will hopefully be part of a long-term solution to providing more mechanisms for implementing the things that we know matter at the local level. The other thing that's important, I think, when we think about deals is there's a really strong focus on the overseas one, that these are about stimulating economic growth within your locality. Sometimes they're focused on key sectors, sometimes they're focused on key bits of economic enabling infrastructure. Obviously, infrastructure is a key theme in the discussion around New Zealand, given what we know about the infrastructure deficit and some of the other work that's underway to come up with more funding and financing solutions. But when you look across the deals, you start to see that they cover, they've been used very flexibly to make sure they pick up on the things that are relevant at the local level, noting that because of the fact that they are also a partnership with central government, you need to sort of be looking in both directions in order to sort of frame the deal in terms of what's going to work for national government as well as local government. We move on to the next slide, George. What you'll see is that deals have been talked about in New Zealand. I think they were first raised by the Prime Minister at the Local Government New Zealand conference before the election. There's been a lot of discussion and interest in deals since then, partly because of the experience of overseas, and some of us who will have had some experience of that and have thought about how these models could work here. But essentially what they've been talked about is this ability to come up with these longer term pipelines of projects that can help address some of those infrastructure deficits and can enable local economic growth. Obviously, there's been a lot of interest, there's been a lot of speculation, there's been lots of articles, including ones that I wrote myself earlier on in the process, but we're still waiting to see a little bit about how the model might be applied and adapted. And as George and Ben said earlier, it's important to sort of keep an agile kind of an open mind at this point until we find out more details, but that doesn't mean you can't start thinking about this now. So when we move on to the next slide, this is probably a quick, there's a lot of information on here, but I'll just pull out a couple of things. So there's a few things that we know. So we know that there's this commitment to the deals, which would be supported by some of the new tools like return to public-private partnerships, kind of tolling, land value capture mechanisms to fund some of the infrastructure that we know that we would need. These tools are going to fall under the purview of the new National Infrastructure Agency, and work's underway to establish that. Separately, we know that there's a commitment to a regional infrastructure fund, which has again got a strong focus on economic enabling infrastructure, and that work's currently underway on the national framework, which DIA are preparing on behalf of government. There's engagement as a cross-ministerial group. There's engagement from several departments on the framing of deals. And what we hear is that we expect to see that framework sort of mid-year, which hopefully means within the next kind of month or so, we might start to see a few more kind of details. Some of the other things that we have heard, obviously this ongoing focus that deals have to be part of the sort of long-term economic recovery, focus on productivity, innovation, kind of jobs growth. So there's a strong underlying link to economic development outcomes. There's also a very clear understanding that we have no new money is the phrase that we're hearing, and that is an expectation of joint funding, not just from local government, but also from private sector partners and possibly opportunities for iwi as well. And the other thing which I think is important and that we've picked up in the kind of conversations is the need to be thinking about how projects that are included in deals are going to be managed and delivered at the local level, and demonstrate that we've got the growing capacity and capability on the ground to implement those deals. But there's still quite a few unknowns, which is why I talk about the need to be quite flexible in how you think about how a deal might work for you in the future. So we're not clear on how they're defining which infrastructure categories within the deal, also the length of the deals. So deals sometimes go between 10 and 30 years when you look at the overseas examples, with a pipeline of themes and a program of projects that fall underneath that. We don't know if New Zealand is likely to be erring towards a sort of, a shorter time period, probably more in the 10-year frame, which of course would still be 3 electoral terms, so potentially quite long in New Zealand terms. While there's quite a lot of noise around, there isn't new funding, there isn't new funds available beyond what might be in the Regional Infrastructure Fund, some of the best deals in the UK have kind of looked at how existing funding might be reprioritised, repurposed, better aligned, in order to actually provide a clear pathway for attracting private sector and other investment into projects as well. One of the things that's still unclear is also this relationship between the deals, the Regional Infrastructure Fund and the new agency. So they're all referred to, but we don't know yet whether there's going to be opportunities to kind of combine these things and different tools in one place. And then the last thing, which is still a bit of an unknown, is elsewhere, these have been the start of a process of devolution and localism, something which is quite important in a relatively very centralised environment that we operate in. And what we would hope to see is that these deals are the start of a process towards more longer term devolution and kind of local control over some of the things that matters the most. So we're waiting. We know these are issues that are being considered. We know that there is a kind of conversation about where you might start. So some references have been made to perhaps starting with the urban growth partnerships that have been doing the work already around sort of some of the spatial priorities and others. But this is all stuff that we will hopefully become a little bit clear, and you can kind of start to respond to as it does become clearer. As we move on to the next section, George, I'm not going to spend too long on this because in the interests of time, but I'll say a couple of things. So As I mentioned earlier, there's examples of these types of deals in many places. We talk a lot about obviously UK and Australia. They take that longer term view. They have a pipeline of projects, and they're based on this principle of localism and devolution. They've got a really clear economic base behind them and a clear sort of focus on jobs and productivity improvements. So while the sort of hard infrastructure elements are important, it's how those enable other economic outcomes. And while we know that the funding challenge is there, quite often what we've seen in some of the overseas deals is innovative approaches to funding and financing. And just to give two examples of what that might look like and why it might be different here. So many of the UK deals included the retention of local business rates. So in the UK model, particularly at the first wave of deals, up to 50% of business rates collected locally were going back to central government for redistribution on a national formula basis. In some of the early city deals in the UK, there was the approach taken of retaining all of those business rates at the local level. So it wasn't necessarily new funding but it was a redistribution of existing funding. I think the other thing to highlight from some of that experience is quite clever use of recycled investment tools. So the idea that the funding that could be made available might support some upfront infrastructure delivery to enable either a new industrial or commercial sites or new housing, but there was a land value capture approach or a rating approach where that money was recaptured, ring-fenced back into the same priority. And I'll give another example of that later. The next couple of slides I won't kind of go into detail, but it gives you an understanding that there's a range of deals in terms of where you sit on this kind of localism agenda. It also gives you some information you can refer to on the next couple of slides as well, if we keep moving through, about what the UK deals look like, some of the details of the examples of the UK, similarly for the Australian ones. The one thing I would note about Australia is they do seem to be moving away from the model. So there are a number of deals that have been signed and are in place and are being implemented. But my understanding from engagement with some of those places is that there's likely to be a significant number of new deals, which is different from how they've continued to roll out in the UK. And they are sort of looking at a more sort of traditional grant-based program in the future. But there are some good learnings when you look at some of the Australian deals as well. And we've got that information in the slides for you. What I will talk about on this side briefly is, because again, I think it's helpful for us when we think about the New Zealand context, is when you look across some of those deals, they have been used quite flexibly. So you can see examples of how they've been used to enable bringing forward new land and premises to enable economic growth. You can see initiatives that are tied to addressing local employment. You can see activities that's about training and workforce development, as well as a focus on things like carbon, renewables, livability. So there's quite a lot of variety in those deal structures elsewhere, and again reinforces the point that there should be a negotiation about what's going to work locally and how do you align them with existing kind of plans and strategies. We'll keep moving down through the next couple. There's a few more detailed examples I won't talk about, but you can look at your leisure. And then I'll say a little bit in the time I've got left about how this might apply in a New Zealand context, noting my earlier caveat that we're still waiting for details on that framework. So the thing that I think is worth us thinking about as we seek to learn from those lessons, and when you think about what might a deal look like or what might you wish from a deal, even in advance of a framework, that there are weaknesses as well as strengths in the models that have seen elsewhere. And a couple of these things are important. So, where you're reinforcing devolution and localism wrapped into the nature of the deal over the longer term, and you can deal with the sort of integration of not only your plans and strategies, but how local different national agencies might come to play. So one of the features of those UK deals was like bringing together alignment between different departments at the national level to support the outcomes at the local level. They did include not just some baseline funding in the UK model, but some of those examples of other ways of funding initiatives over the longer term. That longer term time frame is really beneficial when it comes to thinking about delivering economic outcomes and delivering infrastructure. We know that they can't be delivered in a short period of time. It's telling that some of the outcomes from Provincial Growth Fund are only starting to emerge now. And the other thing which I think is really helpful when we think about the experience of elsewhere is building those kind of strong partnerships at the local level in alignment with government, and having clear sort of measures around accountability and delivery. So one feature of those deals to be conscious of, particularly in the UK, was that by entering into a deal, a local area is actually signing up to deliver outcomes for central government as well as for its locality. But we know that that experience in the UK and Australia has also had caused some concerns. So there's been some issues around two-speed growth with those places that are able to agree and negotiate a deal early on, and others being excluded from that process. They work best when they are about programs and not individual projects, and there's a pipeline of themed around programs. There's some questions about whether the deals have really been added additional or faster growth. So it can be challenging to think about how these deals might deliver impacts and how you might measure impacts over the longer term. So there's some strengths and weaknesses to be conscious of as you start thinking about how a deal might work for you. When we go to the next slide, just another couple left. I think when we want to learn from that experience, we know it's going to be different. We know it's not going to be, have all of the same levers and tools, and it will be the start of a process of hopefully of devolution over the longer term. But there's a few things I think we can learn. So these should be approached as a negotiation. So it should be a constructive negotiation between central and local government, between government ministries and agencies to align around the things that are going to make the biggest difference to your locality. To do that, you need to have a clear, independent, underlying evidence base. So the work that you've been doing around some of this is beneficial already. As I've said earlier, they can't be for everything. So prioritise what you're asking for. Don't see this as a one-off hit. See about this as a longer-term process of devolution and change. Think about some of these new tools and how they might be applied in terms of funding and financing and how that might be recycled. So there's things that we can learn, particularly from that experience overseas, even if we know our model might be slightly different. When you move forward to the next slide, George, the way I've been suggesting this, and so this first part of it, there's two levels. This first comes from the work that we did for Infrastructure New Zealand in the masterclass, and I would give credit to Linda Mead for this kind of component, is thinking about, you could frame your deal around the sort of wider provincial kind of regional growth focus. There are examples elsewhere where deals have been kind of structured really around key industries. So thinking about, are there particular industries that you have competitive or comparative advantage in that can be a deal focused on those will give you great outcomes. There's also examples of kind of those deals where they've kind of leveraged off the connectivity to a major urban centre and kind of have looked at some of the issues. Then there's things that come with that. And then there's this longer term sort of approach where you've sort of got this thing which is really around the sort of a much stronger kind of devolution approach. So there's some different spatial or industrial ways you could think about organising. Again, recognising that at this point you probably want to have thought through a couple of different ways in which you might approach this and then apply that depending on what the framework says. And then on the next slide, advice that I've been giving to places that I've been speaking to is, again, without going too far because we don't know what is going to be on the table and how it might be approached. The work that I think you've already started to do to think about, well, what might the focus be of a deal for us? What are the outcomes? And how do we start to build alignment around a kind of narrative about what this deal is going to unlock? I think there's then you can start marshalling the evidence that you already have to make the case for why this deal is good for you and good for central government, and then have in mind that pathway to delivery in terms of investment planning and implementation. And then on the final slide, which I won't talk about in detail, but is for your reference, it gives you a breakdown of some of the things that fall under those three broad headings in terms of things that I think places can start usefully doing now without going too far in advance of knowing what the national framework would look like. So my final sort of observations is we hope that this is an additional tool that enables places and regions across New Zealand to take more kind of ownership of how they move forward and prioritise the things that need to be done and kind of develop that kind of responsibility and delivery. We wait with some interest to see how the national framework emerges in the next couple of months. And I think the work that you've already started to do, which I know George and Ben will come on to speak to, in terms of how you might be thinking about that for the Selwyn district is the right way to be preparing for this conversation, no matter what it looks like. Just over 20 minutes. We started slightly late, but hopefully that was a helpful input at this stage.
Yeah, that is really helpful. So thank you for running through that. Obviously, a huge amount of experience overseas to draw from, but without needing to be able to copy and paste that here. So it'd be interesting to see what the framework is that the government's coming up with. And they have indicated that local government will see some of that ahead of them just launching it, but that remains to be seen at the moment. You've talked a little bit about the devolution kind of sitting in behind all of this, and that is, you know, while each of the deals looks slightly different, there's some themes that run through that. Can you just talk a little bit more about devolution in our context? Because here we are the most over-centralised country in the OECD, so actually change and devolution, even small changes, when you've only got 10% of the purse, or less than that at the moment, how changes here might look different than some of the other jurisdictions you've touched on?
Yeah, so probably a couple of things that I might say that may or may not be useful. I think the first thing is devolution should be an aspiration of this process for all of local government. And so as you are going into discussions with central government and its agencies, looking for the opportunities that this might present for a longer term devolution, recognising that you might not get everything in the first step. And people talk quite a lot about the Manchester experience and where they've got to. And if you look there, they were doing work before the city deal, and they had combined delivery and other arrangements for the metropolitan region. Since the initial city deal, there's been seven subsequent rounds of devolution. So it's definitely been a process that's been built up over time. So that would be the first thing, which I think is, if we are to see more devolution here, let's assume that this is a start and not an end, and you won't get everything in the first instance. The other thing which I think is a lesson which is quite important to be thinking about here is that some of the, particularly in a context where there might not be lots of new funding, in the experience overseas, particularly in the UK, some of this relates to how you have greater say or influence over how national programs are delivered and how national money might be spent in your location. And a good example of that is some of the employment and skills type programs that are wrapped into city deals in the UK, where what essentially has happened is the local government has taken more control over how national skills funding is allocated and spent in that locality. And that might include the local government being close to some of the key industries to be able to have more direct relationships with some of the individual businesses in those industries in order to understand and then commission directly the types of skills, training, apprenticeship and other support that they might need. And in return for that, the local level is taking on responsibility for delivering against a national target framework. So in a New Zealand context with all of the kind of ongoing disruptions around Tupungaga and kind of work-based training, etc., there's a question in my mind about, does this start to provide an opportunity for devolution to include a greater say over how some of those national programs might be delivered at the local level, even if that doesn't relate to, respond to a fiscal transfer to local government from that. That's one sort of aspect I think should be quite important. There's other things that probably wouldn't quite work the same way. So I gave the example of things like business rates, where in the UK, not all of them are retained locally. And so there's a big focus in some of the early city deals about retaining those business rates locally. That's going to be kind of slightly different. I think for New Zealand, one of the most important parts of this would be to kind of start to identify some of the existing expenditure that goes into your locality that's made by central government agencies, all across the different themes of your deal, and that you look to negotiate, and to think about how do you get more alignment, control and say over those deals, that expenditure. It's slightly disappointing in my mind that if you probably will have picked this up this morning, that there's been a sort of a strong no back to Auckland, to the Mayor of Auckland, around the idea of retaining GST on kind of rates for government. And Nick Willis have said, no, we don't want to see that happening. I think there are ways in which you could kind of you could do that. There's another discussion, the places that I'm working around. Will there be abilities around local visitor taxes, local visitor levies, etc. So there's quite a lot to be worked through in that fiscal sense around devolution. The last thing I'd say is there's also an element of careful what you wish for in the UK context. So be wary of unfunded mandates. And in the UK, there's quite a lot of activity that has been devolved through city deals that hasn't all been fully funded, and in addition has sometimes been used as a way of enforcing local government reorganisation by requiring combined authorities and other types of things as well.
Cool, thanks. I think that's good background. I see there's a couple of questions in the room here, but I just wonder whether we get the team to touch on the specific things that we're going to talk about here before we do that. And the things, are your questions specific to what we might do in Selwyn, or about regional deals themselves?
One Selwyn.
So maybe we could just wait and then do this, and then I'll come to the three of you.
Mine was kind of just reflecting on something then.
Oh, yeah,
in
okay.
the UK.
Yeah,
that's all
right.
right.
Yeah.
Kia ora, Patrick. Thank you very much. Sorry, my name's Sophie. I'm originally from the UK as well. I'm from Bournemouth. And I was just reflecting that, obviously I haven't been there for a while, but the deal that they've had there, so basically the council was required, I believe, to amalgamate with 2 other councils. And then 2 years later, they had what was called a town deal signed. And it had a very specific boundary of where this money was allowed to be spent. So it turned into this whole thing that 3 councils amalgamated, but actually only one low socioeconomic area got any funding at all, and any outcomes or any support or anything. And there wasn't really any devolution going on with it. And I kind of worry about that for us, because the combined population of those 3 councils is pretty much what's in the Greater Christchurch Partnership area. And for me, that would be an equivalent of us doing some sort of GCP deal and then finding that Eastern Christchurch gets all the funding. And I can kind of see that happening, because we already see that through things like the transport choices and the shovel-ready funding. Like, you do some combined work, but actually it tends to be the largest chunk ends up going somewhere else. And I'm just wondering if you had any thoughts about that, because as you say, there's been a lot of variation in how the UK deals have worked and how they've been shared out.
Yeah, you're exactly right, Sophie. And I'm from Brighton, so we'll keep South Coast strong here. I think the important thing I'd say is, yeah, you're exactly right. There are risks around a deal framework as well as opportunities, and so being quite careful about how you kind of manage them and where you see the deal contributing. I think that's where places that have already done the work to understand their broader sort of, their regional economic geography and what's going to make the greatest difference to the region as a whole, and focusing priorities on there can be beneficial. So, we'll be familiar with Manchester. They'd gone through an independent economic review. They already had kind of alignment and joint working on kind of shared issues across the greater metropolitan area. You're exactly right as well that some places have, I mentioned the 0.2 speed growth, and there's been some kind of questions around sort of equity of some of the elements of deals. And more than one example where people have, some councils have, not only been forced to create combined authorities or amalgamate, they've also sort of stepped out of deals as well, and then they're sort of, sitting outside some of the framework. The two things I'd say is, one, that's definitely a risk that you should be conscious of and seek to manage through. The second element, which relates to the sort of funding distribution, I think one of the things which is a feature of the UK deals, which might be hard for us to replicate in the first instance, is that while they take a program approach, underneath those programs, there's a long list of projects, as you can find in most locations, but there has been a independent, or there's been a economic impact assessment of all of those projects to say which of these projects are going to deliver the most jobs, the most local GDP, and therefore we prioritise the ones that fall in those that we can afford, that are in the top kind of quarter of that, so that you know that what's being invested in is the thing that enables the most growth outcomes. The second element, though, which I think is important and I don't think has been discussed enough here yet, despite there being quite a lot of commentary on city deals, is how do you use this as an opportunity to create recycled investment funds that can then fund the next wave of projects and the next wave of projects. So in my slides, you'll see there's an example from Cardiff around a strategic sites fund where the idea was you might fund up front some of the infrastructure enabling works in order to allow for new industrial sites to be developed in locations that have been identified as strategically important and for sectors that have been identified as strategically important. But that there's then a kind of capture mechanism, whether it's through a targeted rate or a land value capture or another tool, which means that when that after that development is underway, there's a revenue return to whatever funding mechanism has been used, and then that's used to invest in the next wave of projects. So that's where the relationship to the National Infrastructure Agency becomes quite important, because if and this would be ideal but maybe hard to achieve, but you can imagine that if a investment in one part of a broader region creates a land value uplift that then can be taxed or captured, there needs to be a maturity in the partnership to recycle that investment into another part of the region to have the new project forward. So that's where the kind of governance and leadership of deals is going to be as important as the actual content of deals.
Well, thanks. Well, we're going to move on, and you'll be first, Elizabeth, when we get to we'll come around to questions again. So we'll get Ben and George to talk us through the Selwyn specific stuff, and then there'll be some more discussion.
Sweet. Yeah. So we'll jump down to value. So we've covered a lot of the background there stuff there. So the key slides there for us is to consider the value that the Selwyn district has, and that's looking at our growth, our proximity, our growing economy, and just the natural environment that we are a part of. But then, as I think this has been framed up by Benji in the economic strategy, the challenges that we're facing around low productivity and those challenges around housing affordability and the like. So, building on top of those ideas that Patrick has put together, there's those three kind of scenarios that we could look at in the regional deals, which is a growth deal around kind of building on infrastructure, a spatial deal around a township, or one on industry. And so those next slides kind of outline what they could look at. The provincial one is really focused on infrastructure and building the base for things to occur from. The other one would be looking at the major urban centre, would be looking at that township, looking at what we can do in that township to unlock its potential. And the last one is that industry focused one, where it's kind of looking at a key element of our district and kind of building a program of work around delivering that. So before we get to those options, and building on previous conversation, we are doing that work. We've got the economic development strategy happening. We've got the future Selwyn work happening, the area plan work, the investment strategy. So these all help lead us to a point where we can build a program of work that could become that city regional deal. And also in our context, we are working in a region and a sub-region, so there is potential for regional deals that look at Canterbury. There's potential for regional deals to build off the urban growth partnership that the Greater Christchurch Partnership has got set up. But there's also things that we can be focused on ourselves as well. So those 4 options that we've put together based on the conversations we've had through workshops with Future Salon, workshops with Economic Development Strategy, all that kind of feedback are here. So option 1 is around recharge, so that's kind of renewable energy element. Option 2 is focused on Rolleston as an emerging city. Option 3 is around the jobs innovation, and that's an industry focused one. And option 4 is around a tourism focus as well. So each of those slides kind of points out what that could look like for us, and how that could work for us. So that's looking at building those partnerships with the university in Orion, using and working with Manawhina on that as well, and providing those opportunities to be a energy innovator, supplier, and leading the way in that regard. And that's that option 1, the recharge. Option 2 is around Rolleston. So it's a focus on how we can deliver housing, how we can deliver infrastructure to improve Rolleston as a hub for our district, and the challenges there, and what partnerships we need in there to make that happen. Option 3 is around that employment and productivity focus that's coming out of the Economic Development Strategy. Those kind of program of work in that we can be using to build on that. And the other one is a tourism one, kind of focused on how we can integrate all those projects around tourism, building on our major environmental thing. So it's all there, makes more sense there. So there are 4 kind of broad ideas for how we can approach that, and it will depend on how the government structures their plan to sort of see what area we can lean into ourselves and what one makes the most sense based on what they are offering. But it's key that we kind of have a good idea now, so we can start to kick that off when we know that. So yeah, the key here was really just to say, have we missed anything? Is that kind of covering everything that you've heard that you'd want to see happening in a city deal for Selwyn? Is there anything else that we should be adding to each of those options that you'd like to make sure we note, so that we can kick that off when we get to it? So sorry, I smashed that out quick, but
it's good. Thanks, Ben. Elizabeth.
Yep, this is for you, Patrick. So page 97, we've got the Australian city deals. It talks about deals framed by the National Smart Cities Plan, and the 3 levels of government, with those focus on economic growth, job creation, housing affordability, and environmental outcomes. Now, I haven't heard too much about Smart Cities Plan, but I have seen smart cities referred to in a few documents coming through. So will New Zealand be following a national smart cities plan? Do we have some direction around like how that's directing us, and are we currently fitting into that structure?
Good question. I think one of the challenges for the New Zealand kind of approach here might be the fact that, do we have a overarching national economic or industrial kind of plan or strategy? And in most instances, you could probably say that we don't. So whether there is some clear guidance included in the framework that's produced that sets out some of the what are the national objectives. So in the UK examples, they said we want this to be to deliver local jobs and GDP growth. In Australia, they talked about their national smart cities plan, which included some of the investment in sort of technology, job creation, etc. as well. So I don't think we can assume that there is an immediate obvious equivalent from this government or from the previous government with the absence of that kind of national economic plan or national economic strategy. But what we might see is some guidance in the framework around what are the national objectives of city and regional deals for New Zealand. But I'm afraid, despite some conversations with government, I don't have a clear understanding of what they might be yet.
Thank you for that. Shane. Oh, Phil, you had your light on you. Done?
Just very quickly, just to be at option 2, which says the Rolleston as an emerging city. I think Lincoln needs to somehow be brought into that as well. It's the places where our populations are dense. And I don't know whether the city deal might be something about Rolleston and Lincoln and how they are together in that space.
Yeah. It can be expanded to that. Can either or both, yeah.
Shane.
Kia ora, Sam. Kei te wiritanga o te kaiho te waka tēnā koe. Thank you, Patrick, for your report and your experience. I guess it's due to lack of national strategy, it's an opportunity for councils such as ourselves to take the bull by the horns and offer a good solution. And I guess reflecting on the past, the tremendous growth that we've seen here in Selwyn is due to natural disaster in part. So potentially with that lens of focus at a central government level, resilience should be taken into consideration in housing and infrastructure and potentially port as well, as we focus on what we have here locally with an I-zone, the opportunity for industrial development to provide resilience at a national scale. So advocating on that behalf, do you think that would be something that would be within the appetite of central government to potentially save money into the future by creating that pathway? Oh, sorry, mate. And there was just one more question around the advantages of partnership with iwi. Given your experience overseas, we have a unique opportunity here, and your thoughts around, I see it's in one of the slides around te tiriti focus, but certainly what do you see as iwi involvement and the benefits to councils?
Yeah, I'll start with that one because I think it's a really important feature to New Zealand deals, which makes them different from anywhere else. So I think there's probably 3 aspects to it. The first one is these types of longer term pipelines and agreements should fit well with an intergenerational focus. So the more that this is tied into Te Aomaro kind of longer term intergenerational focus of what is the key issues for the district and how might the city deal enable them. So alignment with existing kind of plans and strategies and longer term aspirations is critical. The second aspect is when you look at deals anywhere, they are based on having really strong kind of governance and delivery arrangements that have to include mana whenua in that kind of, not just at the table, but being driving some of the discussions and the arrangements around what will a deal be for and how are we going to govern and lead this over the longer term. Given it's supposed to be a longer-term pipeline. And then the third aspect, which we shouldn't forget, is the opportunities for iwi as co-investors in any initiatives that are sort of proposed or delivered through a deal. So I think all 3 of those things are going to be really important. I don't think when we take that longer term intergenerational view, then resilience and economic diversification probably has to be part of the kind of compelling narrative around what is a deal for. I think it's still to be I guess we're still to see within the framework, are there particular types of infrastructure, particular ways that it might be framed for government, and also how much they acknowledge that it's a negotiation. Sure, it should also be based on what's going to be important locally. But what I would say is I think we shouldn't expect the nature of a deal in Auckland to be the same as the deal in Wellington, to be the same as the deal in Selwyn or Queenstown. So if these things are to follow that examples from elsewhere, it should be very place specific and tied into local plans and objectives and how they deliver against national outcomes rather than the other way around.
Thank you.
Yeah, just building on that, I think all those options there do talk to resilience, as we, building a strong electricity generation or something like that that has that kind of talked about it, improving Rolleston's growth at its economic base as well will help do that too. So hopefully all of those covering that, and yeah, again, just building on that iwi partnerships is a key way for us to demonstrate that to government that we're taking this seriously as well. So yeah.
With the 4 options that you've put in front of us, it feels like there's a choosing amongst them rather than saying they're actually all parts of, they could all be part of the same conversation, because we could have the most innovative emerging city powered by fully renewable energy, sitting surrounded by the best backyard. So there's a narrative there that actually they're all one thing. So just interested in why they've been split up. Is that, what's the thinking behind that?
Yeah, so it just goes back to those ways of how those previous city deals have been set up by overseas and stuff. They are sometimes around building infrastructure. They are sometimes around an area in a spatial location, or are sometimes around a job, industry, something. So we're kind of just trying to create options so that if the government says, yeah, we're looking for economic industry-based city deal for you to show, then we can sort of start to lean into that and build that way, rather than sort of trying to go, okay, we're going to put it all into like building a Rolleston deal, when then they come around and say, actually, no, we're just looking for a way of you to deliver infrastructure across your district. So I was just trying to, we could probably take elements for all of them into that. I was just trying to show the different ideas that have been previously done across the world.
Thank you. Deborah.
Thank you. I guess I have a question with what we know so far on page 111 of 125. What we do know is the Regional Infrastructure Fund, with $1.2 billion in capital funding over the parliamentary term of 3 years. Is that 1.2 billion to be split between the whole of local or regional councils? Because then I go to what is still unclear is basically the relationship between deals, regional infrastructure funds, and national infrastructure agencies. The current government is into tight budgeting. So I'm just sort of wondering, is there a real risk that our current Wakatokahi NZTA funding of 51% could be extracted and put into the Regional Infrastructure Fund as an example of how we're going to actually, have $1.2 billion of capital funding available? I guess what's still unclear to me is a real concern, because we don't know what's coming out, what's actually working, how it's going to be working. So I guess that in Selwyn, if we are trying to structure something, it has to be a living document. It has to be able to be changed fairly rapidly with regards to being first off the ranks to apply for what I would term a limited amount of funding, best dressed, first in, we will actually have a better chance, because the reality is that if you're involved in not-for-profits and you've got to apply for funding to actually survive, this model is no different with regards to how you apply for that funding or will apply to that central government funding. So I'm just highlighting the similarities of where we need to be at. Thank you.
Patrick, maybe we could just get you to answer a little bit around the separateness of the regional deals compared to the Shane Jones operated account, which is one is time sensitive and the other is not time sensitive.
Yeah, definitely. So the Regional Infrastructure Fund is probably PGF Mark II. So it's a similar type of fund that's been it's part of the coalition agreement. I don't think they are capitalising that fund by taking from existing kind of budgets. They'll have moved it at this kind of central level in terms of actually how they put money into the front end. The work is also underway for that regional infrastructure fund to be opened for kind of that will be more of an application-based process. And the only thing we know about that so far is in terms of some of the things that Shane Jones has talked about in terms of it to fund pieces of sort of economic enabling infrastructure. So he's talked stuff around things like ports, aquaculture, things like that, things that he can more directly see that there are job outcomes associated with the funding that goes through regional infrastructure fund. What we do know, and while I'm saying we don't really know the precise relationship between the deals and the National Infrastructure Agency, what we do know is that when they've talked about deals, they've talked about using the types of tools that would sit with the National Infrastructure Agency. So that agency is also in the process of being stood up, and will pick up things like whatever. If there's any amendments to things like IFF that already exists, if they are going to do land value capture tools, what they might look like, etc. So I think what we can assume is that if deals themselves have no new money, then part of the ability will be able to utilise some of these tools, but we don't know if any of those require legislation or when they might come on stream. And the big unknown is, can you frame a regional deal as well as pitching for a regional infrastructure project to be part of that deal, or do you have to do it separately? My guess, my advice for what it's worth at this point is approach the two things as separate in the first instance, but look to make the connection. So when the regional infrastructure fund is launched, you want to be ready to go with projects that could form part of that regional infrastructure fund, and that might also then be rolled into whatever your framing of a deal might be in the future. And I think as George and Ben were setting out, your options at this stage are flexible, and then as you start to get guidance from government, you might use one of those options as the key organising theme and narrative for your deal, but you don't exclude some of the other things that are in the other options.
Yeah. So as these city deals aren't just a business case for money; these are partnerships, and we need to be putting something into this along with everyone else that we're asking to join us to demonstrate to government that we are we're taking these things seriously, and then they can join us on that journey as well. So yeah, that's the key focus for these deals. Yeah.
And that's where we want to make sure we don't get into just a transaction. Like, this needs to be about an ongoing relationship and a continuation of something, not just give and take over one or two projects. Malcolm.
Is there any thought being given to mass rapid transit? If we grow at the rate that's being experienced, the motorways are already getting crowded going to the city now. It seems to me there's a real opportunity here if we could leverage to get a corridor, even if it hasn't got the roading on it, but if we could get an infrastructure corridor to the city that we could put mass rapid transit on, then we're going to future-proof ourselves for the next 50 years. And I'm just wondering if which one of these funds would be the best one to put ourselves into. And it is something perhaps we could, with the Greater Christchurch Partnership, do with our partners to get enhanced corridors. Because we don't know what we're going to put on those corridors. It mightn't necessarily be a car, but we do need those corridors to the future. Just a question?
Yeah, so I would hope that if there was a sub-regional deal through the partnership, that would be a key focus around MRT and protecting that. But even for us, if we're looking at that spatial area of Rolleston or at Rolleston and Lincoln, if we expand that, then that would also include how we are working with Waka Kotahi NZTA on those, even just identifying and protecting corridors in order to coordinate growth. Yeah.
Elizabeth.
Just going to page 96. I wanted to thank you. I found it really refreshing that you didn't just put all the nice things, but you've actually put some of the hard truths about some of the decisions that have gone on when you've talked about Plymouth withdrawing for various reasons, like less power and control over transport, and some of the key sticking points with the objections for the need for elected mayor, those kind of things. I actually found that really good. I think it's good to have that really balanced argument, and it'd be really good to know how we can identify those with the things that we're putting forward, going forward in the future. Is there a way to take what's happened internationally and give us that editing lens so that we can avoid the same sort of problems? Because obviously what's really key to us is that localism and having the decisions and not losing the local voice, and being able to have the community in behind and supporting these projects.
Yeah, really, really good observation. I think there are lots of merits in this approach, but there are definitely warnings from history. And I'd say that there's another slide I could show you that also shows that the level of funding to local government in the UK has also gone down over the period of localism and city deals. And I'm sure you're already familiar with the number of local authorities that have, in the UK that have gone bankrupt in recent years. So there are some things to be cautious of. What I would say is two things. Having a really strong governance framework around however you approach the deal that is gives you both from an elected member but also a kind of a wider community and iwi and business at the table, so that you are at least aligned and clear on what you're either up for or looking to achieve through the deal. I think some of the lessons, and many of you will be familiar with, so there's been a number of focuses recently on the Manchester experience, the power of having an individual who has the mana to lead the negotiation and lead, particularly if you're working across a sub-region, multiple partners and multiple areas, and can hold constant all of the different outcomes you're looking to achieve, becomes quite important. I then think there is the need to, through that kind of governance and implementation structure, to have a really clear kind of almost project management approach to risk management around any of the things. So, making sure that if there are programs or projects that get supported through a deal, you've done your due diligence on, amount of times we've underfunded at the outset particular bits of infrastructure and then been surprised by the fact that they've gone over budget, but they were actually always underfunded at the outset anyway. So being just quite careful as you step through the stages of this, depending on what it looks like, to make sure that you're not creating sort of challenges for yourself or your partners later on. So go in with open eyes and look at how you use this best to achieve the outcomes for your community, and not being prepared to accept just anything in the negotiation.
Sure.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say thanks, Patrick. We've come towards the end of our time, and just really appreciate your input, and it's been really helpful. I'm just going to say, George and Ben, is there anything else you want to add at this moment in time?
No, so we'll just continue a watching brief from where we get to with what the government announces, so we can then take what we've done here and we'll continue to work with Patrick on that and come back and be like, well, here's what we've heard. This is where we're kind of head. But until we've heard that, we'll just kind of wait and see.
Great. Thank you both. We'll adjourn now and take lunch.
Thank you.